why I'm Bruce Dumont back. Nice to have you with us wherever you're listening from coast to coast and border to border. We're back for hour number 2, and we've been talking. We talked a little bit about what happened or what is happening in the state of Virginia, but I want to go back to that subject and get to the issues of the lieutenant governor and the charges of sexual assault that have been leveled against him. And it brings up again the issue of when a woman decides that she's going to bring a charge against a public figure. Peter, should there be any kind of statute of limitations? I mean, a woman who obviously knew the lieutenant governor, knew when he was running for office, said nothing, and now that he is about to be governor, on his way to the governor's mansion, suddenly she realizes that he did something allegedly inappropriate with her several years ago. Is that fair to him, or what does it say about her?
I mean, I think these sorts of crimes and actions are really obviously raise some difficult questions. One of them is the fact that these present women with a big challenge of coming forward. A lot of stigma surrounds sexual crimes, sexual violence. I know, I can count, sadly, I need more than 2 hands to count the number of female friends in my life who've been the victims of some form of sexual assault that have never stepped forward because it's simply easier, to them in certain situations to try to kind of lock it in and move on. Unfortunately, those create wounds that sometimes fester over time. And as life goes on, I think women and people become more wise and more experienced, and maybe they reach a point where they feel, comfortable enough stepping forward. In Lieutenant Governor Fairfax's case, I don't know these 2 women, obviously. I don't know what the facts are. I know one allegation happened at the 2004 DNC convention. Another happened when he was at Duke. We don't have all the facts, but I think these are credible allegations, and I think they should be investigated. And if it turns out to be that they're substantiated with evidence or facts, then he's not fit.
Do people running for office, regardless of their party, do they have to be vetted more strongly by either newspaper reporters, by journalists, by political parties, by professional oppo research people who really do a proctoscopic investigation of someone's background? Do they have to be more properly vetted? Eric?
No, I mean, yes and no, and I say no because I think we're doing the wrong thing with politics. We're expecting people who have done nothing wrong in their entire lives to be the ones that lead us. And I'm not saying that people who do like really bad things in their past should, be the front runners to lead and govern, right? But what I am saying is that most of the people in this country have some form of religion that they ascribe to, and that religion has some form of forgiveness clause in there, if you will. But when it comes to politicians, we're like, nah, none of that's a no-go, right? And so we have to remember that these are humans, and again, like I said earlier, it sucks that we don't have time for due process in this moment for these individuals. And I think that's a risk you take as a politician, that if you're 10 years into your career, something comes up that derails it, you have to make the right decision for your constituents, which more often than not would probably be for you to stand aside so that you can have due process. And then if you're vindicated thereafter, then you're vindicated thereafter.
I think that one aspect of all of this is that the Democrats, in attempting to take down Kavanaugh, quite openly abandoned the idea of innocent until proven guilty. And one of the people who did so was the former Attorney General of Connecticut, who had been the editor-in-chief of the Yale Law Journal, Dick Blumenthal. And you had others like the senator from Hawaii who openly abandoned this. I want to raise one other issue. The Washington Post had this information, and it had more substantiation about it than about anything that they ran on Brett Kavanaugh, and they killed the story. Now, to me, that raises very serious questions. Maybe they shouldn't have run this story, but if they shouldn't have, then they shouldn't have run the other story. There's got to be some sense of even-handedness, or else the papers themselves look like a wholly owned subsidiary of a political party.
They're not?
Steve.
I'll just tell you, I wish Peter's common sense, level-headedness, that he said earlier, that all women should be heard, not all women should be believed. And yet that was the narrative, 24/7, 365 during the Kavanaugh hearings. Believe all women.
And now they're hoisted by that petard.
That is exactly right.
Sorry, I don't want to cut you off. But I was going to say that, I think people heard Dr. Ford's testimony. They saw her. And people are entitled to reach their own decision on whether to believe her or not. In my opinion, I obviously am a pupil of the Supreme Court history, and I'm a huge, obviously, fan of the Supreme Court and what it's done and how it's developed over many decades. But I want my Supreme Court justices to be basically held to the ultimate high standard. And I think the fact that there was a credible allegation, and I think the way, actually, I found the way Justice Kavanaugh came out and, if he had come out and said, look, I had a lot of beers as a young man and I may have done something stupid, but I could tell you that I'm a father, I'm a basketball coach, et cetera.
There's no evidence he even met her.
No corroborating
evidence.
evidence.
A number of people called for him to resign before she confronted him, and he responded. So what you say is a reasonable position. I don't agree with it, but it's a reasonable position. But there were a number of people who were calling for him to resign, and Senator Feinstein had that information much earlier, and it could have been privately investigated, and she held it back.
I think Senator Feinstein should have done so, but I think she, as she claimed, she withheld it at the request of Dr. Ford, who did not want this to become a big public circus. Which
well, then why did she release it later?
Right. I don't believe that.
I don't. That
all
sounds
politics.
hard to believe. By the way, on the subject, your point about holding the Supreme Court, I was in Florida over the weekend, and flying back last night, I saw the documentary RBG about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, not the theatrical picture about it. This is the documentary,
CNN documentary,
and it's a terrific. I mean,
good.
even if you disagree with her politics or some of her decisions, I mean, this is an incredible human being. Everybody should take a look at that.
One of my former students is in it.
I thought I
Her
saw
granddaughter.
that she
her
passed away.
granddaughter.
Clara.
Clara. Yeah, Clara. Clara and I had many conversations about her grandmother and her grandfather, who was an extremely distinguished lawyer, for several years before I realized that her grandmother was Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
And
Has
it's-
anyone
it's a
seen
beautiful
her
love
lately?
story.
She's okay.
Are you sure?
She's
But
doing well.
I want to go back to something you said when you said it's all politics, which is, I think we could probably all agree about. There are credible allegations out there and credible, evidence to support allegations, but the way these women's claims get politicized by both sides is appalling.
Yeah.
This is not what I think anyone wants to teach, like this generation of women, the next generation of women, their daughters. All women should be heard, and credible claims should be vetted and
And you also have a lot of lawyers. In the case of Michael Avenatti, I mean, he was out there with yet another story, and frankly, I think he by getting involved, he made it worse for.
Is he sleeping with the
course.
fishes? We hadn't heard anything about this guy.
His CNN credentials got taken away or something because
He
he's.
was the next president. That's what I heard.
He was no, but there were charges against him, and I believe those charges of sexual assault have been dropped.
Yeah, it was
Sexual, I think it was
They were
sexual
just
assault.
assault.
domestic
Yeah.
domestic violence, I think, against his wife.
Yeah.
Domestic violence. Bruce Dumont back shortly. Bruce Dumont back in Chicago. The President of the United States is going to go to El Paso, Texas tomorrow. He's going to be at the Wall. There's going to be a rally there. I'm sure he'll bring up the subject of the Wall as he's seeking to find a way to keep the government open and also get some money to build the Wall. George is listening to us in El Paso on KTSM, one of our oldest affiliates, and he's calling in to share his thoughts. George, nice to have you with us.
Good, thanks. I am doing that. The reason I'm calling is because there are so many voices here in El Paso who are so one-sided that you only hear one voice to any issue that pertains to the border wall. In fact, the border wall has provided for El Paso that safety that it enjoys, so much so that the El Paso Police Department does not patrol the streets at night downtown. In fact, I ran into an incident last night in which there was on the street speaking a black minister, and he was just voicing his religious views, and amongst him around him were a group of people, younger people, who were videotaping him and asking him questions, harassing him, bothering him, and nobody said anything about that. And I came upon them because I was coming back Sacred Heart down here in El Paso, and I approached him, and it wasn't for my having cussed them the way that I did, they would have continued doing that molestation of him.
Well, you know, the president has said that El Paso is now one of the safest cities in the United States. Again, you're talking about a specific incident, but again, we've gone an hour and 15 minutes into this program, and we've not talked about the wall.
It's
but again,
true.
it's one of the key things that the president is still trying to address.
Yeah.
And do you think, at this point, do you think the president, I'm going to ask this to Stephen Tucker, do you think the president now is more concerned about making sure that the government not gets shut down again, or coming up with the $5.7 billion that he really wants for the wall? If he's torn between those two conclusions, which one do you think he's likely to go with?
He's going to fund the wall arbitrarily. The Democrats will not give him $1 for the wall. Contrary to popular belief, thanks to local news reports, the wall has already been started being built last summer. So they just want to do improvements. Obviously, we're not going to have a wall from sea to shining sea, but there are areas where a barrier wall is extremely important. So the president's going to get it one way or another. He doesn't have to declare a national emergency. He has the power. Barack Obama declared 10 national emergencies. Multiple presidents did before that time. This is not anything unusual. So I don't think we'll see another shutdown because the president will do what he needs to do to secure the American border.
Do you think that's going to be the case, Peter?
Yeah, I mean, without agreeing with the intent behind it, I think ultimately the president will be able to, get the funds via national emergency or something else. But I did want to point out one thing, note one thing about El Paso. So I just have a note here. In 2008, before the border barriers had been set up, in El Paso, the city had the second lowest violent crime rate among more than 20 similarly sized cities. And in 2010, after the initial fencing went up, it held its place. So, I mean, the crime-fighting potential of a wall is debatable, at least vis-a-vis El Paso.
Is that true, or did you read that in the New York Times?
It's true.
Because I
It's
read
true,
the
and I'm
same
happy to
piece.
source it for you
So
as
the-
well.
I read
the same piece.
Everything I'm
Fake
saying
news
is
New
true.
York
The
Times.
wall that Israel set up on the border with Sinai, where people were coming in from Africa. I think there were 14,000 people who had come in across that border before they put up the wall. And after the wall was put up, there were under 20. The walls can actually work and can be done in.
But that was a very small.
Yeah,
right? That was a
but let
very,
me-
Very
small
small
wall.
But
you know,
let me
Between
let
Tijuana
me
and
just-
California? That's a huge wall.
Sorry about Israel.
Let me just
Oh,
about Israel.
yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Let me just say
works
that
great.
I thought that the best way to have handled this for the Trump administration was not an either or, but a both and. The Democrats are saying we want all these different things to interdict people who cross, I would call it illegally, but they would say without documents, or stay here after their visas run out. And they put a lot of emphasis on that. And then Trump on the wall, I don't see why he just didn't make them an offer that they would have refused, but it would have just been said, okay, let's do it all. None of it's very expensive, frankly.
A year ago, he could have gotten his wall in exchange for, basically getting through the Dreamers issue, but I think he woke up and saw Fox and Friends, and they were, down on that. And
But
like,
he offered-
issue
he offered
was
amnesty
chain migration, and I do think that there is an issue. You raise an important issue, which is, do they want the issue or do they want a solution?
Well, the question is, you
Well,
can
they
ask
want
that
the
question.
issue.
You can ask the question of both sides.
That's
about
what
that.
I'm saying.
Yeah, that's what
both
he's saying.
sides.
He said
yes.
that earlier, like that. It's just to get something.
If they wanted to solve the problem,
Go
they
ahead.
would have
Because-
accepted
because
DACA,
no, right,
all
go
the
ahead,
proposals
Steve.
the president provided, DACA twice, Dreamers, all the stuff he offered, and Chuck and Nancy walked away. They don't want to fix the
how-
problem.
I think
they want to
actually-
roll
I
this
don't know
into
that it was
2020.
So did
Exactly.
Paul
Actually,
Ryan.
the-
So did Paul Ryan. walk
Yeah,
away.
It was
I
the
mean,
Schumer
Stephen
shutdown.
Miller
and
and Trump
and to be
walked
honest,
away.
like, look, like
No, it was a
had-
Schumer shutdown.
Had Trump went further, had Trump even to this day, if he goes further, then I need pieces of a wall, because if any of you have ever been down to the border,
Yes.
there are sections of walls that have been up for quite some time.
Yeah,
and
sure.
And I'm not on the side that walls are ineffective. They are traditionally very ineffective, though, unless they're really small. But we're talking about, let's do little pieces of wall. Let's bolster the Border Patrol themselves. Let's make more numbers of those individuals down there. Let's do smart walls. Let's use the technology that we have. We have drones and all these other
Hire
things.
immigration
It's
judges,
more
hire
cost
personnel.
effective. It's more
All the things he
effective
says
overall.
he wants now.
But drones
now
really
he's,
don't
like,
stop
yeah.
anything.
But today it looked
Drones
like the
just
Democrats
spot where they are.
were demanding fewer beds for violent criminals in exchange for part of the wall
They were
funding. That
demanding
was just
fewer
crazy.
beds, fewer beds at ICE facilities because the fear is that ICE will gather folks who are not violent criminals.
And
just everywhere.
realistically, everyone is forgetting that the numbers are down. They've been down year after year after year. Less people are at your term, illegally crossing.
Well,
and
that's true
your
until the
term,
last year and a
undocumented
half.
crossing.
We've
But
had a huge
is-
influx
one
the
of
last
the-
18 months.
It's gone down for
One
quite
of the
some time.
things
On
the
the company
president,
miners.
I mean, he has been talking about issues of national security. He's been talking about drugs, MS-13. He's got a litany of things as to why he wants to build the wall.
Let's talk drugs.
Let's talk about drugs. Let's spend the next couple of segments just talking about drugs. How bad is the drug situation, and how aggressive do you want Congress to be?
Yeah.
I'm going to turn to you.
Yeah, no. In my lifetime, my short 33 years, it is like coincided with the beginning of the war on drugs that Nixon started,
Yeah.
that Reagan put out in the
The
forefront.
explosion, yeah.
Right? And so here's what I know to be true. Over a 15-year span, Portugal decriminalized, essentially legalized, all forms of narcotics, right? And what they saw was in the year 2000, it was per million, there was 100 deaths related to drug overdoses or drug-related things, right? In that 15-year span, it went down to 4. I'm not making, that is 4, from 100 to 4 per million, all right? So what they did was they shifted the idea between criminalization, where you're doing heroin, sir, you're going to jail. That doesn't work. We know that doesn't work. What they said was, sir, you're doing heroin, we're going to get you the help that you need, okay? And what that did was that changes the way the society around them also looked at those people. So those
How would you deal with fentanyl?
with fentanyl? Well, again, here's the thing. Hold on, though. If I made fentanyl legal tomorrow, which it is actually, right? Because I can get it from a doctor, yes? If my doctor gives me fentanyl, I can take it, right? And which is the first
But
problem.
they've cut
not-
back
it's not
on the
given as a prescription.
renewal of the
But-
prescriptions.
well,
That's the problem.
Under care of a physician is
Yeah.
what I'm saying. Okay, so, but
Yeah.
if I made heroin legal tomorrow, would you do it, sir?
Oh,
No,
in a
no,
heartbeat.
really. Yeah,
in a
right.
heartbeat. I've been looking for a good heroin
The professor
supplier.
is obviously on it right now.
Yeah, so where I'm going with that is,
Charles,
yeah,
people may have lost the irony, so
yeah.
clarify.
Would you do it tomorrow if it were
clarify
legal?
what you mean.
Yes or no, Mr. Whitaker?
Oh,
Remember
I'm-
that one? Answer the question, Mr. Whitaker.
Don't put words in my mouth, Bruce. No,
Right,
I'm not
and no.
looking to do. Yeah, of course you're right.
You know where I'm going with that, though,
My
right?
point
Yeah.
about this is, I personally think that there's a lot to be said for decriminalization, for needle exchanges. I'm all in favor of that. And I think there's another very big problem that we have basically gutted our inpatient mental health system. So
Yes.
a lot of the people who
Oh,
are
yes.
on the streets and who are druggies are people who ought to be getting inpatient
Look,
service.
here's the question, Peter. I want Peter and Stevens. Are we at a point in this country where being tough on drugs, not a war on drugs, but being tough on drugs, is not the politically popular thing to do? Stephen?
I would say for any parent whose child was found in the snow, frozen to death by abuse of any opioid, especially fentanyl, it's going to be an extremely important issue. For the rest of the country who has not had a personal exposure to this kind of tragedy, I don't know that it's the top of the priority list.
It's going to come up because Bill Barr is himself very tough on it in the same way that in the same way that Jeff Sessions was. I think that most people are where you are, Derek. I think that what they really want is some solutions, that they're not ideological on the drug issue anymore. What they want to see is less addiction, less pain.
Peter, what about you? By the way, we should mention for those listening on the radio, you've identified yourself as 33 years old. Derek,
I am
right?
33, yes.
Okay, Peter, you're mid-30s, aren't you not?
Yeah, 38.
Okay, so my
I
question...
identify as 33.
Well, we have...
Yeah, true story.
We have two guests this evening who are in their 30s, and we have two guests this evening who are older than that. I'm not going to go say how old you are. You're probably the second oldest person at the table. I'm probably the oldest. But my question to you is, if you're 33 and you're 38, the people that you know, and I'm not asking whether they're drug users, but they probably have smoked marijuana at some point in their lives.
Oh, yes.
And there's a sort of a laissez-faire attitude about drugs. So if someone is running for sheriff or U.S. senator or president that's tough on drugs, you are going to be less likely to support them, are you not?
I mean, you could be tough on drugs, but what I'm looking for more than anything else is, do you have a sensible drug policy, a sensible approach that makes sure the maximum number of people in America are safe, and if they choose to have marijuana in their system, they could do so safely and they're taxed on it. So I'm just looking for sense.
And
because
they
the
want
one-
the drug gangs
Oh, of
attacked.
course, yeah.
They
That's
want
what I
don't want
MS-13.
that
I
No.
want to come
That
back
comes
and
down to
now
border
talk
security.
about. I want to hear from our over 30s as well
Way over
when we
30.
come back.
Why are we not building roads?
Bruce Dumont back in Chicago. We continue our conversation. And now let's go to our over 30s. On the issue of drugs, do you think people of your generation, within your sphere of influence, and you may have friends that occasionally partake of recreational drugs as well, but is your generation looking for people that are tough on crime? Do they want the return of a Nancy Reagan approach to fighting drugs?
They don't think it worked. And remember, my generation, if I'm older than Steve, my generation was late 60s, the Beatles and, you know.
You were all strung out.
And, yeah, I mean, geez, you know, you could get high from secondhand smoke in college where I was. So I think people are pretty flexible. The thing that's hard to take us as representatives is that attitudes differ depending upon whether you're an urban or rural, whether you're highly educated, not highly educated, race may matter. My sense, though, is that more people are practical about this than ever before. They just want to see people not strung out.
Yeah.
Steve, is
I
this
agree.
is this a position where, if you ask people their position on drug legalization or making marijuana recreational, is this a big difference between what it means to be a Republican and a Democrat? Is that one of the reasons why the Democrats may be more successful in reaching out to younger voters, minority voters? How much of that may be related to Republicans tending to be more rigid on drug-related matters?
Yeah, I think historically they are, but I mean, you look at the large swath of the Trump base, many are libertarians.
Yes.
And libertarians have been pro-pot, pro-marijuana, and legalization of it for a very long time. We may soon, in Illinois, have legalized marijuana usage. I know sick people with multiple sclerosis who use derivatives of marijuana to alleviate their pain. So I don't think that's even on the blip with most people. I think it's illegal immigration.
You're
So,
right.
but when
and
you're
economy.
talking about moving it to the next step, when the president is out there, I would say sort of saber rattling about that he wants to build the wall because he wants to stop the flow of drugs into the United States. Is that playing well? If you have Republicans in his base or libertarians in his base that aren't looking to have a crackdown on drugs because they want their marijuana or whatever the case may be, and then you've got Democrats who are younger and hipper and of a generation where
Trump
they
isn't
don't
talking
care.
about marijuana, though. He's not talking about marijuana or
Thank you.
MDMA or psilocybin. He's talking about like life-ending fentanyl
But
and
I
things
think
like that.
Bruce is
But
correct.
Big jump from
I know
marijuana
what
to
you're
fentanyl.
saying.
No, but he uses the big word drugs.
Yes.
It is.
Right.
He uses drugs, and then he says fentanyl.
Yep.
Because that's
That's the
tied.
buzz drug right now. Like, you even asked me about
that's right.
fentanyl. That's the buzz.
So
But
the-
remember when it was
Well, we
crack?
had the
That's the-
largest
that's the
bust
big one.
ever 2 weeks ago
But
on
he
the
still
border.
talks
Yeah,
about
yeah.
No,
drugs.
you're right.
Which was that-
and I
yeah.
think for some people they're going to hear that, and I think it's going to conjure up kind of the non-hip, old, Nancy Reagan, like just say no. But for most thinking people and thinking voters, that's not even. I mean, that's not. I would love to make that argument that this guy's anti-pot.
Well, Sonny, let me tell you a couple of things here. And the thing I want to say is that I do think that while the drug issue may not be super salient, I do think that a lack of the Republicans' identification with a number of socially conservative issues are off-putting to highly educated people, many of whom have fled Connecticut and New Jersey and so forth because of taxes, and they've made states like North Carolina, possibly even South Carolina, now Texas, into purple states.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that has to do with a number of social issues, though not necessarily drugs.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, look, it goes back to legalization. I mean, you take the reason why there is so much money behind going through our checkpoints with these drugs, like that big fentanyl bust you just spoke about, is because it's profitable, right? And that profitability brings crime via the black market.
Sure.
So, part of legalization is not just so everybody can get all, hopped up and have a great time. That's a literal way that we can reduce crime. We can give the tough on crime people what they want. It's really sad that they want to be tough on crime, but they're missing the mark on
imagine
how
a
we
piece
could
of
probably do
legislation.
that. We could do it.
So when you say that, I just imagine a piece of legislation where the preamble, like a bill to get everyone hopped up and party all the time.
Yeah,
'Cause it's not. It's,
yeah,
it
it's
is
not
problem,
that. It's,
apparently,
taking
the
power.
problem with
Yeah.
fentanyl is that once people have used it for a while, besides the fact that it's very addictive,
Right.
The effects reduced, and then they go to a synthetic heroin.
Right.
And it's very easy to overdose and die
Right.
on
Is it-
that.
but
Yeah, that's-
during this period, when you have municipalities like Chicago and around the country that are talking about recreational drugs, whether it is the state of Illinois, where it's been discussed with our new governor, or on Colorado, obviously, and Washington State and a variety of California, where that is now the issue, is the person who does not partake of that and views that there is a potential downside to society, they're wasting their time. They're trying to convince a public that doesn't want to hear the evidence because they've already dealt with. They don't think that marijuana is a gateway drug or marijuana is going to affect the brain cells of a teenager. So they're rejecting all of science because of their political desires or because of their
It's
generation.
that, like when he was talking about we were talking about the mask, right? You were saying it was a Twilight Zone where someone was wearing a mask and they wore it for so long that that's what they were now.
Right.
And that's exactly what you just described. Someone who's been parroting these ideas for 10, 20 years of their political career, and now they can't say anything contrary because they'd lose their voting base.
That's right.
But it
I
doesn't.
think
It
it
doesn't.
They can't stand up to it. Yeah.
It doesn't deter from the validity of the issue.
No, it does not.
Right? I mean, we have marijuana. There is forms of marijuana. Dibs, which is a pure
Dabs.
form.
Dabs.
Debs. Sorry, I'm too old. But whatever it is, it can be very deadly, and especially in a young, growing mind.
I don't know that anyone's died from a dab. I don't think there's any recorded marijuana-related deaths.
But young minds are susceptible
I've
to
been
damage.
interviewing.
Not so much older minds, but
I have
younger
been interviewing candidates for mayor of Chicago. And by the way, if you go to Beyond the Beltway with Bruce Dumont, the Facebook page, you will see some of the recent one-on-one interviews that I've done with candidates. And virtually in the 5 to 6 that I've done, virtually everyone, with the exception of Gary McCarthy, everyone is for legalization.
Yeah.
And
McCarthy,
that's-
actually, here we have to.
People should know
but
McCarthy's the
this is-
former police commissioner.
But
Yeah,
the only
McCarthy.
the only one that brought up the subject of that still she is aware of the potential dangers to a young mind.
Absolutely.
Marijuana
Absolutely.
Was Lori
The same can
Lightfoot.
be said
The
of
only one-
nicotine.
the
The same
only
can be
one
said
that
of
brought
alcohol.
that up.
The same can be said of
Yeah,
nicotine.
go
I
ahead.
mean, even Coca-Cola and soda.
Yeah.
These have detrimental effects. Anything in the developmental stage of a human or
Yes.
whatever. But I was going to say, this is like the war on drugs and drugs. This is such a golden opportunity for bipartisan progress.
Yeah.
We have decades of studies on marijuana, THC, and we could say, look, this is going to be no more
It was
harmful.
one of the most.
Pardon?
It was one of the most effective parts of Trump's State of the Union when he pointed to the woman who had a nonviolent drug
Yes.
offense and had been in prison for something like
That was a
20
beautiful
years.
moment.
It was
Yes.
it was a very touching
Beautiful
moment.
Yeah, and it could be an opportunity for global recognition once again as a leader in the world, right? Because the drug policies around the world pretty much stemmed from what was started with Nixon. I mean,
Not only that,
And
having
Canada
this-
has changed. Does anybody
Canada
know
may-
what kind of evidence we're getting from the changes in Canada?
yeah, everyone's chill and having a
Yeah, I
great
mean,
time.
But
and
they
like,
weren't chill in Canada
you know, I mean,
before.
so they
were already
yeah,
chill.
even more
Justice.
chill
Quite
now,
as good
like-
as hockey as they used to be.
the criminal
They're a little
justice,
slower.
the
Yeah,
Criminal
no.
Justice Reform Act, which every time I've talked about it, I said that was an effort between Obama and Durbin that has been carried over. But I'm happy with the result. That you could achieve so much criminal justice reform if you take a look at what the controlled substances are, and you have a sensible drug policy. And if you have a sensible drug policy, you take out a lot of folks who probably shouldn't be in jail, and you make them members.
Well,
taxpayers.
that's something that during the long deliberations, and you're right, Durbin was involved with it, and Trump and Jared Kushner has been a key cog in the wheel here. I mean, they've gotten Republicans and Democrats to agree, and a lot of it has to do with drugs and the people who are in jail for in prison for drugs, and that's part of they're now trying to come up with that's the First Chance Act. They're now beginning to come up with working on the Second Chance Act. They want to expand on it, but
The original draft, the First Step Act that was drafted under Obama with Durbin, went much farther than this, and Senator Grassley had agreed to that version.
Right.
But here we are, so I would like to see this trend continue, and it's an opportunity across all presidents for bipartisan reform, and it's something we need. And drugs is an easy place to fix it.
But there's one thing I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, and that's I'm forgetting the guy's last name, Representative Hamim, number 3 or 4.
Jeffries.
Yeah, Jeffries. He was, along with Congressman Collins from Georgia, they were the two guys that began working on this in the House. You mentioned Durbin and Grassley were working on the Senate. They've been working on this for years. Yeah. So the president signs it, 6 weeks ago? 5-6 weeks ago? On Martin Luther King Day, Jeffries is giving a speech to his constituents, and he refers to the president as the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. And this is the guy that's now trying to author the next step.
Great.
And I'm saying to myself, what the hell are you doing?
Yeah.
Why do you insult the President of the United States after he has just signed, albeit a bipartisan bill that probably is the most dramatic bill in criminal justice reform in 30 years?
Well, it's
Why
not-
do you insult the
It's
president?
not
by
just
saying-
him. I got an email this week from somebody who is very well educated, PhD, all the rest, and the language that this person felt viscerally about President Trump was just that strong. And I'm really struck by the depth of the social divisions, and it goes beyond the people who are out front politically.
Yeah.
TDS, Trump Derangement Syndrome.
Back
We must
shortly.
find
Is
a
Is that
cure.
related to ODS?
Dumont back in Chicago. Thanks very much for joining us. And during the break, Derek, you were singing the praises of Texas. You're originally from
Yeah.
Brownsville and San Antonio.
Yeah, it's the
We have a
greatest.
lot of listeners. This show is very big in Texas.
Yeah.
So tell everybody why you love Texas so much.
Well, firstly, as I told everyone, it's the greatest country in America. You all changed my mind, right? No, Texas it's a great place. I actually tell a lot of people here from Chicago if they're asking like, hey, I need to go somewhere. I have a family, and living in Chicago is probably not best for my family. I send them to San Antonio or Dallas or somewhere down there.
Both
in
my
Texas.
children live in Austin now.
Yeah, you did tell me
Adult
that,
children.
And
If they're
they
young
listen
and-
every Sunday night. They listen to us on KLBJ, don't
Yeah.
they?
Yeah. Yep.
That's right. We're very big in Texas.
Austin's a cool place.
Texas,
Yeah, it is.
Texas itself is a remarkable state, and the growth that's occurred in Texas. And the
Exploding.
the 4 big cities in Texas are so different one from the other. Houston's very different from Dallas, very different from San Antonio. Austin is closer to Madison or Ann Arbor than it is to Houston. So
That's what happened to everyone in the progressives and the liberals, if you will, from around Texas. They all eventually congregated because the UT is in Austin, so it was like a hotbed of free thinking, So yeah.
Question to you. We mentioned, we promised last week, we didn't talk about it. Venezuela. You've written on the subject of Venezuela. What is your take, Charles?
It's really striking. Trump, who's largely pulled back from overseas involvement, has been very careful, actually, about Venezuela. He has really ratcheted up the economic sanctions, and he's appointed a key point man, Elliot Abrams, who's very knowledgeable and
Iran
experienced.
Contra, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
Old timer.
he's an old timer, very experienced. And my sense is that what's happening now, and we led the recognition, along with a number of Latin American states, it's a true multilateral coalition, recognizing the alternative to the Maduro government, that is to say, the person who was elected by, in effect, their Congress, and not by the fraudulent election that turned in Maduro. What's happening now is, can Maduro pay his military? As soon as he loses the military, he's out. And he's got support from Russia. He's got support from Cuba. He's got a little support from China and some others. But
Is he getting financial support?
That's the key, Bruce. You put your finger right on it. I don't think the Cubans don't have money to put in.
Right.
And the Russians can put in a little, but not enough to continually pay the Venezuelan army. I would say that the real issue is not whether Maduro goes. I think it's quite likely he goes. I think the real issue is whether these outside forces plus the Maduro-Chavez people try to wage a guerrilla war and destabilize the next government in the same way that the Russians have acted in Ukraine.
Well, that's the thing. Like, why, again, like, we keep doing this throughout history. We go into these areas of the world that, for whatever reason, we say up front that it's for, helping humans and all this stuff. And don't get me wrong, what's being done to the Venezuelan people by their leader is pretty ridiculous.
Well, we're not leading this.
Well, but
They're
hold on.
leading it.
Hold on.
We're
But
just giving backing.
Right, but as the global leader,
Yeah.
right, our opinion carries the utmost weight, and so everyone else kind of followed our lead, and we weren't there when these initial conversations were happening. What I want to say though is the same thing that happened in Iraq, and it's still happening in Iraq. Those remnants should have been a lesson for us with what's happening in Venezuela now. Do you understand? Because you just said it. The vacuum could happen, and now it's a power struggle, and more people are dying. And and I'm not. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think the whole, I think from the Arab Spring, and we should know by now that if you topple kind of a military strong man or woman, although there weren't any in the Middle East, obviously, you leave a vacuum that gets filled with the next strongest force.
Correct.
I think to what you said is obviously, particularly in South America and the Americas generally, the Monroe Doctrine has, for a very long time, kind of guided what America allows, the other powers, traditionally European powers, to do in South America. I'm just curious what you think. What is it about Venezuela that has caused? Because there's plenty of other stuff going on in South America that Trump's been silent about. What about this has caused Trump to kind of take this
Why
stand?
Venezuela?
Well, first of all, I think that the issue came up independently of him. There was you could see that the Maduro government was beginning to collapse. So I think he just moved in on the issue. I don't think that he's made any commitment to have more than a handful of troops, which you could imagine would be there to protect leaders and maybe do special ops. But my sense is that Trump is going to be very careful about an on-ground commitment. There's one other country we should be aware of. There have been a huge involvement by Chavez and Maduro with Iran. Iran has filtered a lot of people into that area. It's a really bad actor.
That is partially true. There are a number of Iranians in that area, but it's not to the degree that's been reported. But also, what I would like to say is there are some rumblings of another multinational oil corporation funded thing going on in this region, right? So the commonality between what happened in the Middle East with Iraq is kind of happening again now, and there are some oil interests behind it.
I don't think that oil was the issue in Iraq.
Was the John Bolton note on his legal pad, was that a mistake or a deliberate?
Good question.
Normally,
I think he.
No, that was on
I think he
that
knew
was
what
staged.
exactly.
He did that on
I
purpose.
think he knew exactly.
He did it on purpose. That's ridiculous.
He was a classmate of mine, but we didn't know each other.
Really?
Yeah.
We're going to tell that story the next time you're with us. You're going to tell us all the things you don't know about basketball. Charles Lipson and Stephen Tucker, they have been on the right side of our table this evening, and Peter Addis and also Peter Hanna and Derek Addis have been with us. I don't want to say representing the left, representing the younger generation, the young folks. Our program this evening is produced by Genevieve Production. Thanks to Sam Greenberg and Fritz Goldman for their assistance in the production of the program. I'm Bruce Dumont. Good night from Chicago.